The Lethbridge Herald on March 26, 1931, announced the following on its front page. Quote, "Marooned on a loose ice pack in the North Atlantic. Surviving members of the crew of an unidentified vessel, believed to be the sealing ship Viking, were drifting seaward with the floe off White Bay," it was stated in messages reaching the government from that point today. The vessel had been burned to the water's edge, the message said.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Viking in the pictures.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The dramatic loss of the Viking would have most likely made front-page news in any case, but the people on board of her, as well as her status as one of the oldest sealing vessels in the Newfoundland sealing fleet, secured her status as headline news. The Viking had been built in 1881 in Norway. She was a wooden steam vessel of 586 tons, and was designed to join in the Arctic sealing fleets from the start. In 1882, she headed on a voyage to the waters around Greenland with a passenger on board that would be her first brush with fame, though no one could know it yet. Among the people on board was a young man named Fridtjof Nansen, who would go on to be a famed Norwegian explorer and scientist. On this voyage, he would see the Greenland ice cap for the first time, and begin a plan to cross it someday. The ship, having taken the famed explorer on his first trip to the Arctic, was something that one of the former captains of the Viking would later brag to the papers about. It was true that it would be several years later that Fridtjof Nansen would begin his exploration, but the Viking had played a role in the start. The Viking would continue in its capacity as a sealing vessel, and was eventually acquired by the Boring brothers of Newfoundland in 1904 to join their seal-hunting fleet. Through most of her career that followed, she would be captained by Captain William Bartlett, who was appointed her captain as soon as she was acquired in 1904. On the rare occasions when he was not placed in command of her, he was generally serving as the captain of the Terra Nova, another old wooden steam sealing vessel owned by the Boring brothers. When this occurred, his son, also named William Bartlett, but better known as Captain Bob, would take over the command. Captain Bob was a well-respected captain in his own right, and he had served as captain of Peary's ship on his voyage to the North Pole. Over the years, the wooden steamships which had once dominated Newfoundland's seal-hunting industry would slowly diminish, and the Viking would become one of the oldest ships of the sealing fleet. But she continued to head out every season. It was not just the wooden ships that were disappearing. At one time, the fleet had consisted of 350 ships or more as they sailed from Newfoundland for the season. But as time went on, their number shrank to around a dozen. The Viking was an aging ship in a trade that was shrinking rapidly. In 1930, the owners of the Viking received a request from a man named Vadik Frazel. He wanted to charter their ship to film a movie he intended to make called Northern Night, which was later renamed White Thunder. The ship could continue its seal hunting activities, with the crew and officers acting as extras in his film, in which he intended to use the sealing industry as his backdrop. Frazel was a native of New York, but he was no stranger to the sealing industry, having spent summers in Newfoundland previously and signing on with a sealing vessel one summer while on break at Yale. The experience had made a lasting impression. He had taken thousands of pictures, which he had turned into a film, and it had also exposed him to stories of the industry. One story that particularly stuck with him was one another sailor told him about two men who were in love with the same girl, but had ended up in a survival situation, and the two men had been forced to work together to reach safety. It was a story that stuck in Frizzell's mind, and when he graduated and went into the film industry, he began to work on the idea of turning the story into a film, which he called White Thunder. In his script, the ship would wreck on the ice, and the survivors would be scattered on the ice, with some making it to shore and others succumbing to the cold. The Viking was a logical choice as a ship to set the story on. As one of the oldest and most storied ships of the fleet, it had a distinctive look that would be compelling on film. Fortunately, the Boring brothers agreed to this request to charter their ship. Unfortunately, the SS Viking was not immediately available, so they first chartered the SS Ungava and shot some scenes on board of her before the Viking returned from her first voyage of the season, and they were able to set out. Captain William Bartlett had retired, but Captain Bob was available, and they set sail under the experienced captain. The seal hunting window as set forth by the laws of Canada was a short season, and the men's voyage on board the Viking was only a 5-week one. During that time, they did the remainder of the filming, with Captain Bob and his crew appearing as extras and minor characters in the background to let the audience get the feeling of a working vessel at sea. Captain Bob in particular got a reasonable amount of screen time in the role of Captain Barker. They returned after 5 weeks and edited the film. Once they felt it was complete, they showed it in a private viewing only for Frizzell to come away from the viewing with a feeling that the film was still incomplete, and the people at the viewing told him that it was not dramatic enough. The film needed more scenes that gave the audience a sense of atmosphere and an understanding of the conditions the characters were enduring. Part of the crew returned with Frizzell with the intention of making additional footage of icebergs, ice fields, seals, and storms. They once again chartered the Viking for the sealing season, but this time it was under the command of a 28-year-old Captain Abram Keene Jr., who Captain Bob described as a good and careful captain. At 4 p.m. on the 9th of March, 1931, the Viking departed from port at St. John's and headed towards the sealing grounds. Frizzell had hoped for some chances to film heavy weather, and almost as soon as they traveled from the view of land, a gale struck them. The snow and storm reduced visibility and kept the crew busy, meeting the first person who noticed the two stowaways who had made their way to the deck was wireless operator Clayton King, as he left the wireless room. Normally this would have resulted in the ship turning around and heading back to port to turn the stowaways into the police, especially so early in the voyage. But Captain Abram decided against it. They had already been the last ship of the fleet to depart. The stowaways were allowed to remain on board, though they were told that they would be handed over to the authorities at the end of the voyage. The next few days were endless rough weather, with the men all having to go to the pumps to keep the water from overtaking the ship, and the ship's galley equipment was all washed away. Frizzell and his companions, an explorer named Sargent and a cameraman named Penrod, joined in to help sail the vessel. Frizzell in particular, with his previous experience on a sealing voyage, proved himself useful. The Viking was still a good ship, and in spite of the obvious strain on her through the storm, they were able to reach Bonavista Bay, where there was a lull in the storm. They were able to put everything back in order, and sent men to shore to buy new items for the galley. They departed from Bonavista Bay on the 14th in much calmer weather, and the crew was generally in an optimistic mood. Adding to this, Frizzell used a tablecloth as a screen and showed the crew the film he had been making for the entertainment of all. As night fell on the 15th of March, 1931, the Viking was off of White Bay and encountered a large ice field. As was common practice for such a situation, Captain Keene directed her into an ice jam and ordered her engines to slow. This would keep the ship in place through the night, and they could try to force their way through the ice field the next day. With the ship safely in place for the night, the crew relaxed, and Frizzell, as well as members of the crew, gathered in the ship's saloon to warm themselves and chat. Clayton King would report that Frizzell was busy writing warning signs to put up around the ship to warn people that there was gunpowder on board and other explosives, because he was worried that people were being too careless with their cigarettes. There was nothing unusual about the explosives being aboard. It was considered part of every normal sealing vessel because sometimes the ships needed to blast their way through the ice. That did not make it any safer, and while Frizzell was thinking about it, he also requested that some old and damaged flares that were kept under the captain's bed be thrown overboard so that they would not accidentally go off. The man he told to dispose of the flares carried them away after arguing for a little while about wanting to do some experiments with them the next day. A moment after the man departed, the ship gave a sudden lurch. It was violent enough that the stove in the saloon fell, and the people in the room were thrown around. The moment that the ship righted herself, all of the men ran out of their cabins and the saloon to find out what had happened. As they ran, a sudden explosion caught them. After the first explosion, a second followed that was even more violent. The ship, which had been orderly only moments ago, was now engulfed in flames, and many of the men on board of her were injured. Pat Breen, one of the engine crew, had been in his bunk but was thrown out of it by the blast and was badly injured. He still tried to make his way to the engine room to help anyone who was trapped there, especially since the first thing he thought about was that there had been a boiler explosion, but he was driven back by the flames. King threw himself from the ship, his legs smashed by a wooden beam, and his clothing on fire, but alive. Elsewhere around him, other people landed on the ice either from the explosions or from throwing themselves from the flames. The explosions were ongoing. The Viking had been full of combustibles. There was the highly flammable film from the film crew, dynamite, shells and black powder from the shells, and the flares which had never reached the ocean. The Viking was an inferno in minutes, with the fire starting in her stern. The last that anyone saw of Vedek Frizzell was his being trapped in the blazing mizzen rigging and becoming engulfed in flames. Captain Keene was on the bridge when the ship exploded under his feet. He had been flung 12 feet into the air and tossed on the ice. As he tried to sit up and realize what had happened, a rain of debris began to fall around him, adding a new risk. As he looked at his ship, he realized that the Viking was a mass of flames that engulfed the entire ship by then, with her entire stern blown off. Captain Keene got to his feet and went in search of other survivors. The first person he came upon was his brother, Alfred Keene, who served as second mate, and who had also been thrown from the ship. Alfred Keene had a broken leg, and was unconscious, but he was still alive. As the ship burned, her engines were no longer pushing her forward, and she drifted from the ice, and with a strong wind blowing, the blazing ship began to be carried away, leaving the injured, bloody, and dazed men stranded on the ice. Over the next hour, the Viking burned to the water's edge, but 2 of the ship's boats broke free from the burning ship, and some of the men got into these. Others began to make their way across the ice by jumping between the pieces and over the gaps, heading to Horse Islands. Alfred Keene and others were left behind because they could not travel on the ice due to their injuries, but they were told that help would be sent. Life had imitated art. Just as Frizzell had imagined in his story White Thunder, there had been a shipwreck on the ice, and the shipwrecked crew was now scattered, injured, and battling against the cold. King was also among those who were in too bad of shape to travel across the ice. As the ship repeatedly exploded, he tried to escape, only to land in the water, but fortunately, Sargent, the explorer who had been traveling with Frizzell, was nearby and helped him back onto the ice. Sargent also managed to go and get Kennedy, and with a heroic effort, he managed to move the 2 injured men from where they would be in danger from the exploding ship and fire. Kennedy was less injured than King, and King admitted that if it was not for his smashed legs, the other 2 men probably could have reached the shore, but they refused to leave him. Instead, they found the stern section of the Viking, which had been blown off of the ship entirely, and landed on the ice, and this gave them some shelter. The 3 men built a fire and were able to gather some supplies that had been blown onto the ice by the blasts. On the chunk of ice, the 3 men drifted away, eventually being taken over 20 miles from where the Viking had sunk. King would admit that, as they floated, he became more and more mentally unstable, but that Sargent kept pulling him closer to the fire and away from the water's edge. The next morning, Sargent was also beginning to become more anxious, and King woke up to him screaming that he could not be left alone. King was slipping in and out of consciousness, and Captain Kennedy was hardly breathing, and was showing signs of pneumonia. Sargent tried to hold on to hope by asking King about whether or not Horse Islands had a wireless operator, which it did, and thinking that if anyone had reached the shore, the wireless operator would have surely put out a call for help. In this he proved correct. A call had been put out for help by the wireless operator on Horse Islands. 18-year-old Otis Bartlett and the entire SEAL fleet did their best to come to the ship's aid. Unfortunately, they were slowed by a tight ice pack which had blocked the Strait of Bell Island after the fleet had passed through. There were other ships that were closer, though. The Foundation Franklin, a salvage tug, was immediately dispatched, as was the former sealing vessel-turned-government steamer, the Sagona. Both ships were loaded with medical supplies, food, and doctors, for what everyone knew was likely to be a grave scene. The wireless signal was choppy and full of interference, so he was forced to send the news out repeatedly through the night after seeing the explosion on the horizon even before anyone reached the shore. But he had managed to send out word, and help was on its way. At first, only 20 or so men arrived on the island, which reportedly only had 5 houses, but more would follow. The people on the island opened their homes, no matter how crowded they became, and lit fires and burned flares, in the hopes that they could guide more survivors onto the beach. It proved successful, and it was later reported that 60 men had managed to reach the shore. The men were mostly incoherent, and it would take some time for anyone to determine what had happened other than there had been an explosion. Though the cause of the explosion would never definitively be determined, one of the men would state that there had been men filling canisters with gunpowder to blast their way through the ice that they found themselves surrounded with the next morning. While they were filling the canisters, the spark from one of the men's pipe had fallen into the gunpowder. It was hard to prove. After all, only one man from the aft of the ship would survive. But it was the generally accepted theory that was held even by the later official inquiry. As more and more men reached Horse Islands, the situation got more grim. Many of the stragglers were bringing with them injured men who needed medical attention, and there was none on the islands. There was also no chance of getting them to the mainland due to the ice. The rescue ships needed to hurry, as Otis Bartlett reported to the outside world. Captain Keene, as well as many of the other men who reached the shore soon after the explosion, would be criticized heavily, not only by the public but also by the inquiry, for not attempting to make any effort to help the people who were injured, but instead only looking for their own safety. The exception was Master Watch Johnstone, who had stood by injured men for 42 hours before rescue arrived after refusing to leave them behind. Sargent, who had also refused to leave behind injured men, was picked up after 65 hours on the ice with King and Captain Kennedy by the Sagona, which was looking for survivors as it approached Horse Islands. His determination to save the two had meant that his name was placed among those who were missing, presumed lost in the explosion. The toll was further diminished when they found the dory of the Viking, which had drifted away, holding 7 more men. They were in rough shape, but they were still alive. In total, 28 men were lost with the Viking, including Captain Kennedy, who succumbed to pneumonia. King would continue to drift in and out of consciousness. The Sagona spent some time trapped by the ice and unable to leave Horse Islands, but was able to soon depart with the survivors on board. Once the ship reached port, many of the people on board were rushed to the hospital, not just King, who would eventually have his feet amputated due to them being crushed and then frostbitten, but also Captain Keane and his brother, one of the film crew, and several members of the crew. Though the 28 other people who had been on the Viking were not found among the living, hope remained for some time. Frizzell's father dispatched a plane to search for his son, but to no avail. It only resulted in a large fine from Boston after the plane made an unauthorized landing in that city to refuel in its rush to the scene. Newspapers also rushed to send planes to the scene, though in this case it was to take pictures of the disaster. But almost all owners of airplanes refused the offer, saying it was too dangerous. This was justified when one of the planes they did manage to charter crashed with the photographer on Horse Islands, though everyone survived the accident. The sealing fleet also did not turn back on learning that 2 ships had been dispatched to the scene, and it was estimated that 10 days had been lost by the industry as a whole, greatly eating into the profits of this short season due to the ships all rushing to search for survivors. The film White Thunder would eventually be released, but under a new title, The Viking. The movie met with generally positive reviews, though it was mentioned that the sound was poor in some parts. This was due to Frizzell having done something novel when he decided to record all of the sounds live on the scene while shooting the movie, rather than dubbing over later. It was a film that would have made cinematographic history, therefore, with or without the tragedy that was associated with it. But the real-life story that had attached itself to the film was not soon forgotten. The release of the film, The Viking, included an introduction that spoke of those lost, including the film's director, and acknowledged the tragic end of the ship, The Viking.
For more information, please see The Viking's Last Cruise by Clayton L. King, published in 1936, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.